The gospel reading this morning, I am continuing in my sermon series, Stops Along the Way. Today is the last sermon in that series, here on this fifth Sunday of Lent. And this last stop is going to be the upper room, just before Jesus and the disciples and the apostles go into the garden, and then Jesus goes to the cross. So I invite you now, if you're able to read, if you're able to turn to your text at home, to turn to John 13, verses 1 through 12. Now I apologize, I think I had put 1 through 11 on the website, but I'm going to add that extra verse, and you'll see why it's really, really important that I do so for the purpose of my message this morning. So I invite you now to open your hearts and hear the word of the Lord. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin, began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who is bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you?" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Amen. When I was growing up in my home, I started noticing that my parents had some odd little everyday habits that I simply did not understand. Mom saved everything. I mean everything. Things that most of us would normally have thrown away. She saved aluminum foil, scrap paper, glass jars, and actually any kind of container. My dad was also one to reuse discarded items, never failing to pick up a nail or a rusty old screw that he saw on the ground and put it somewhere, save it. They were also fanatical about turning off the lights in every room and not using a great deal of hot water, which meant showers in our house were very, very quick. Or else you just took a cold shower, one or the other. I really didn't understand their lifestyle behaviors for a long time. And actually for a while, I resented what I perceived as their stinginess or their obsessiveness. It became very irritating. But it was in the sharing of their family histories in my later years that I finally understood why my parents behaved that way. They were children of the Depression. We know that the Depression was a catastrophic national event that did something. It did something to those who grew up in it. And though my parents themselves were never desperately poor in their childhoods, they adopted the common culture of those years. And it never left them. Dad is now 92, and Mom is 89. And I can assure you, they still have those habits, though they lack for nothing. Now lately, I have been wondering what our latest national crisis, this global pandemic, is going to do to us and to our children. Of course, it's a little hard to say because we are at the beginning of what I believe, and many others believe, will be a more prolonged event than we are hearing. But I already know how it has changed me and my family. I don't think my family or I will ever take hand washing for granted. Ever again. And I have learned, I'm trying to learn, to count 20 seconds as I wash my hands, singing happy birthday to myself. I also think that in future flu seasons, we will be more cautious about distancing ourselves from others. We even know the exact length of that distance, 6 feet. And while we are all waiting and praying for the day when we no longer have to hunt for toilet tissue, disinfectants, soup, rice, and other staples, I do think that we will experience periodic shortages for a while, even after the crisis is over. Why? Because people will remember those empty shelves, that feeling of frustration. And I think stocking up, even if it is just buying one extra little thing, will become probably a lifelong habit in our culture. We may get that one extra package of toilet tissue or paper towels. In all this and in other ways, what I'm trying to say here is that COVID-19 is doing something to us, much like the Depression did something to my parents. And it is something that will not go away when the situation returns to what we might have called normal. The reason being, normal will have a new definition. We will have a new normal. Conor Friedersdorf recently published an article in The Atlantic titled, "You Will Adjust to the New Normal," which addresses the emotional experience of the changes that are being thrust upon us right now. He writes, "Millions of Americans are just now beginning to process the severity of the situation. If you're feeling overwhelmed as you try to assess what this all means, know that this is normal and perhaps even a useful response. Tough times are ahead, and almost everyone is going to have their life disrupted for a while. The adjustment reaction is a step that is hard to skip on the way to the new normal. But most do adapt." Most do adapt. When Jesus washed the feet of the apostles in the upper room as a prelude to their Passover meal, he concluded by asking them a question. "Do you know what I have done to you? Now, it's an oddly phrased question, and different from what we might have expected Jesus to ask of his followers. Because when we think about what Jesus was going to do, going to the cross for our sakes, rising again, calling us to him, then we might think he would ask the question at that moment, do you know what I have done for you? Do you know what I've done for you? That's what we would expect Jesus to ask. But think about it. There is a crucial difference between Jesus saying, do you know what I've done for you? And do you know what I have done to you? I think Jesus was creating a new normal, a new paradigm. Not just for his followers on that evening, but for all believers, for all time, and to some extent, for the whole world, which is still the paradigm today. We cannot take the act of foot washing, nor Christ's question to the apostles, out of the context of the traditional Jewish understanding of the Passover. Let's not forget that Jesus was a Jew. Passover was about the root experience of Israel's religion. God's intervention to free the chosen people from slavery and guide them into a promised land where God would make them a great nation. While the Passover rituals focused on the historical and theological memory of the evening when the angel of death passed by the doors of the Hebrew slaves. Remember, they had sprinkled blood, lamb's blood, the blood of the lamb, over their doors. The greater thing of the Passover was the permanent change that event represented. A people enslaved became a free people. A God who had seemed as if he didn't care. A God who seemed distant and unapproachable acted with clarity and power to show caring and compassion upon God's suffering people. And a marginalized and oppressed population, a group of slaves, became a purpose-driven nation. A nation locked hand in hand with the one true God who would call them forth to literally change the world and change it forever. God had done this to the Hebrews. God had transformed them into Israel. God had literally changed their reality. And that was always the meaning, the heart of the Passover. Clearly, Jesus intended the foot washing in the upper room to be a permanently transformative experience for his followers. In the Gospel of John, the upper room is a climactic stop along the way to the cross, and it is the final shared meal between Jesus and the disciples before his crucifixion. While Jewish religious tradition framed the events in the upper room, the tradition did, and the tradition of the disciples did, Jesus radically changed the form and the function and the meaning of that tradition of Passover itself, starting immediately with a custom that was expected only of the lowest servant or the lowest slave in any household in first century Palestine. Jesus got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. For the disciples, Jesus turned their world completely upside down with this act. Jesus was their master and their teacher, two titles which fit very comfortably into the normal hierarchy of their society. From the top to the bottom, a culture that was highly stratified, where you knew who was at the top, and if you want to extend it to the Roman Empire, there was the emperor, and you knew who was on the bottom. Slaves, the criminals, the marginalized. A highly stratified culture. Jesus took their normal understanding of that stratified culture and became himself the lowest slave of the household. And in doing so, Jesus has met with both astonishment and resistance from those who had literally been serving him for the last 3 years. They didn't know what to do with this. They didn't know what he was doing, or even how to accept it. Peter, in his usual role, speaks for all of the disciples when he questions Jesus' act. Lord, are you going to wash my feet as well? And Jesus answered very patiently, you do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand. And Peter said to him, you will never wash my feet. Peter is so reliable when it comes to representing humanity, representing our hearts. And he's so reliable in expressing our resistance to change, our resistance to disorder. The culture within that small group of disciples had been very well established by the time they had reached the upper room. Jesus was the master. Peter, James, and John were the leaders of the apostles, and the apostles were the leaders of the disciples. How many ever there were. We know it was a changing number. We can also trust that Jesus had shared previous Passovers with his followers. Passovers in which he did not do such an unusual thing as washing their feet. How do we know that? Because Peter is so astonished when Jesus does it. Clearly, he had not done this before. Peter's emotional reaction to Christ should be very familiar to us. All around us right now are people who have decided to act as if the coronavirus pandemic simply didn't exist. Yet daily, those same people, like all of us, are confronted with the reality of this epidemic, be it as innocuous as empty streets and absenteeism and social distancing, or as deadly as the need for a ventilator, or even the death of someone we know or a loved one. When reality changes, we either accept that reality has changed, we either adapt our lives to it, or we suffer consequences. And that's a fact for everything. The change that Jesus established in the upper room speaks to both the nature of God and the nature of human existence. In Jesus, the nature of God was revealed as a God who loves the world so much that God would set aside divinity and become to us a servant, a foot washer, a God who washes feet, who takes the lowest place in our households, a surrendering God, a God who dies the most senseless of deaths so that we may live the most reasoned of lives. In the Passover, God gave the chosen people a purpose. But in the coming of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, we became God's purpose. We did. Instead of humanity acting on behalf of God through the habits and the dogmas of religion, God acted upon humanity through the love of God's Messiah. Instead of compelling us to obedience, God invited us to believe by means of grace. If the Passover in Egypt was God's act of physical freedom for the Hebrews, the death and resurrection of Christ was God's act of spiritual freedom for all people and for all time. Another Passover, a new reality of Passover. In his book, The Purpose-Driven Life, Rick Warren writes these words. Jesus specialized in menial tasks that everyone else tried to avoid. Washing feet, helping children, fixing breakfast, and serving lepers. Nothing was beneath him because he came to serve. It wasn't in spite of his greatness that he did these things, but because of it. Listen to that again. It wasn't in spite of his greatness that he did these things, but because of it. That is what Jesus did to the disciples, did to them on that night, in that last stop before the cross. In washing their feet, Jesus made them great. Not great as defined by the world, or by religion, or by culture, but as defined by Christ. Greatness as love, greatness as compassion, greatness as expectation and faith, and greatness as purpose. Life does things to us, doesn't it? Life does things to us, both good and bad. But God did one thing to us that can never be changed, can never be changed in the face of sickness or poverty or strife or even death. After washing their feet, Jesus asked those who loved him a question. Do you know what I have done to you? It is the same question we seek to answer in the Lenten journey. Lord, what have you done to us? Lord, what have you done to me? The answer can only be found when we love each other and the world as Christ loved us. And that is a journey we never make alone. That is why we are formed together and called together to be the church, wherever we are. What Christ has done to us can never be undone, nor can his love be undone that we share with the world as the people of God. That is our reality. And so, I end this sermon series with Jesus' question. Do you know what I have done to you? Yes, we do, Lord. So what can we do, Lord, for you? And here is Jesus' answer. Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, the least of these, you did so unto me. That is our journey. A journey beyond the cross. A journey beyond the open tomb. Our journey. And in that journey, you and I, following our Lord, have many stops to make. Many lives to change. Many hearts to heal. May that journey be in our hearts every day as we follow our Lord and as he leads us in his kingdom.